If you ask most people what causes inflation, they'll tell you it's complicated. Supply chain disruptions, corporate greed, energy prices, labor shortages. Maybe, if they've taken economics, they'll mention demand exceeding supply or talk about the economy overheating. These explanations sound sophisticated and get repeated by media commentators, politicians, and even economists who should know better. But they're all variations of misdirection, ways of avoiding the uncomfortable truth that inflation has a single primary cause that's been understood for centuries. Governments and central banks creating money faster than economies grow. The secret history of inflation isn't about complex economic forces beyond human control. It's about deliberate policy choices made by people with names and faces, choices that transformed inflation from a rare wartime emergency into permanent peacetime policy, from an economic disaster to be prevented into a target to be achieved. Understanding this history means recognizing that inflation as we experience it today, the continuous erosion of currency purchasing power that destroys savings and transfers wealth, didn't exist for most of human history. It was created intentionally in the 20th century through a series of decisions that broke the link between money and anything real, gave central banks the power to create unlimited currency, and established institutional incentives that make perpetual inflation not just likely but inevitable. The story you're about to hear isn't taught in economics courses or acknowledged in central bank speeches, but it's the real history of how inflation stopped being an accident and became the most effective tool for extracting wealth from ordinary people that governments have ever devised. For most of recorded history, inflation as we know it didn't exist. Prices fluctuated year to year based on harvests, wars, and trade disruptions. But over long periods, money maintained its value remarkably well. A gold coin in ancient Rome bought roughly the same basket of goods as that same coin would have bought centuries later. The reason was simple. Money was actual commodity, usually gold or silver, and the supply of monetary metals grew slowly through mining at rates roughly matching economic growth. Governments could debase currency by mixing base metals with precious metals in coins, reducing the precious metal content while maintaining face value. This created inflation as the debased coins became less valuable. But debasement was limited by technology and by the risk that citizens would reject debased currency in favor of foreign coins or bullion. Under the classical gold standard that prevailed from roughly 1870 to 1914, price stability reached its peak. A basket of goods that cost $100 in 1880 might cost $98 in $1900 and $102 in 1910. There were fluctuations, periods of mild inflation and deflation, but the long-run trend was essentially flat. Money held its value across generations. A person saving for retirement could calculate how much they'd need based on current prices with reasonable confidence those prices would be similar decades later. This wasn't because governments or central banks were managing prices skillfully, it was because they couldn't create money arbitrarily. Currency was backed by gold, and gold supply grew slowly and predictably. World War I shattered this system. Governments suspended gold convertibility to print unlimited money for war finance. Britain, France, Germany, and other belligerents printed currency far exceeding their gold reserves because fighting the war required resources beyond what taxation or legitimate borrowing could provide. The result was wartime inflation that destroyed much of the 19th century's price stability. After the war, attempts to restore the gold standard failed because the ratio of currency to gold had been permanently broken. Too much paper had been printed relative to gold reserves, and governments faced impossible choices. Either dramatically reduce money supplies to match gold reserves, causing massive deflation and depression, or abandon gold convertibility and accept that money was now just paper. The interwar period saw both extremes. Some countries attempted to restore gold convertibility at pre-war parities, creating deflationary pressure that contributed to the Great Depression. Others abandoned gold entirely and experienced inflation or hyperinflation. Germany's Weimar hyperinflation from 1921-1923 was the most dramatic, with prices doubling every few days at the peak and ultimately requiring currency replacement after the mark became worthless. But dozens of countries experienced severe inflation during this period as monetary systems broke down and governments discovered they could print money to finance spending without the constraints that gold backing had imposed. The Bretton Woods system established after World War II was an attempt to restore some gold discipline while maintaining government flexibility. The US dollar was fixed to gold at $35 per ounce, and other currencies were fixed to the dollar. This was supposed to provide the stability of a gold standard while allowing individual countries some flexibility to adjust exchange rates if needed. But it contained a fatal flaw. the US printed far more dollars than it had gold to back them. As long as other countries didn't try to convert dollars to gold, the system could function. But the dollar-to-gold ratio became increasingly absurd as US spending, particularly on the Vietnam War and Great Society programs, required money creation far exceeding gold reserve growth. By the late 1960s, foreign central banks were converting dollars to gold at accelerating rates as they realized the dollar was overvalued relative to gold. The US gold reserves were draining away. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon announced the US would no longer convert dollars to gold, ending Bretton Woods and severing the last link between money and any physical commodity. This was presented as a temporary emergency measure. It became permanent. Since 1971, the entire world has operated on pure fiat currency systems where money has value only because governments declare it does and people accept it. And with no constraints on money creation, persistent inflation became not just possible, but inevitable. The Great Inflation that followed from roughly 1965 to 1982 was the first prolonged peacetime inflation in American history. Prices rose at rates exceeding 10% annually at the peak, destroying savings and creating economic chaos. The conventional narrative, still taught in economics courses and promoted by the Federal Reserve's own historians, is that this inflation resulted from mistakes, that policymakers didn't understand the relationship between money supply and prices, and that once Paul Volcker became Fed chairman in 1979 and applied proper monetary medicine by raising interest rates dramatically, inflation was conquered and lessons were learned. But this narrative obscures more than it reveals. The Great Inflation wasn't an accident or a mistake. It was the result of deliberate policy choices made for political and economic reasons that policymakers understood perfectly well at the time. The motive for inflationary policy dated back to the Great Depression and World War II. The Employment Act of 1946 made it federal government policy to promote maximum employment, production, and purchasing power. This created pressure on the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates low and money plentiful to maximize employment even at the cost of price stability. And economists provided theoretical justification through the Phillips Curve, which suggested a trade-off between unemployment and inflation where policymakers could buy lower unemployment by accepting higher inflation. This theory gave political cover for inflationary policy. If inflation was the price of full employment, and full employment was a legal mandate of federal policy, then inflation could be presented not as a failure but as a necessary trade-off. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, the Federal Reserve pursued policies that allowed excessive money supply growth specifically to keep unemployment low and the economy growing, knowing this would cause inflation but judging the trade-off acceptable. Arthur Burns, Fed chairman from 1970 to 1978, is often blamed for allowing the Great Inflation. But he was following the prevailing economic consensus and responding to political pressure from presidents who wanted low unemployment and strong growth regardless of inflation consequences. But there's an even deeper and more hidden history of the Great Inflation that recent economic research has uncovered. The conventional view blames monetary policy exclusively, the Federal Reserve allowing too much money growth. But financial regulations, particularly Regulation Q, which imposed ceilings on interest rates banks could pay on deposits, played a crucial and largely unrecognized role. Regulation Q prevented banks from raising deposit rates even as inflation increased and market interest rates rose. This meant savers earned negative real returns on deposits. Money in savings accounts lost purchasing power to inflation faster than interest accumulated. When deposits offer negative real returns, people have strong incentives to spend rather than save. This suppressed saving drove up aggregate demand, which pushed up inflation in a self-reinforcing cycle. Higher inflation made deposit returns even more negative, which discouraged saving further, which drove demand higher, which caused more inflation. And critically, by making deposits unattractive, Regulation Q starved banks of funding and choked off credit supply, making aggregate supply inelastic precisely when demand was surging. The Fed's monetary policy couldn't effectively combat inflation because Regulation Q disabled the transmission mechanism through which higher interest rates would normally slow the economy. The origins of Regulation Q were New Deal-era banking reforms that sought to prevent bank failures by limiting competition for deposits. But by the 1960s, as inflation rose, these regulations became the mechanism through which inflation became entrenched. When Congress finally began removing deposit rate ceilings in 1978 with money market certificates and small saver certificates, and then fully deregulated deposit rates in the 1980s, inflation began to fall even before Paul Volcker's dramatic interest rate increases. This suggests that financial deregulation allowing market interest rates on deposits was as important as monetary policy tightening in ending the Great Inflation. But the public story credits Volcker alone, portraying him as the hero who single-handedly broke inflation by raising interest rates despite enormous political pressure. This narrative serves important purposes. It makes inflation seem like a technical problem that requires expert central bankers to manage. It obscures the role that financial regulations and fiscal policy played in creating and sustaining inflation. And it establishes the precedent that central bank independence and willingness to impose painful medicine is what prevents inflation, rather than acknowledging that structural reforms limiting government's ability to create money might be necessary. There's another hidden history in the fiscal theory of the price level, a framework that explains inflation through government fiscal policy rather than monetary policy alone. This theory points out that every monetary expansion has a fiscal counterpart, government debt and deficits. When government runs deficits, it must borrow. If that borrowing is monetized, meaning the central bank creates money to buy government bonds, the result is inflation. The fiscal theory argues that the Great Inflation resulted from unsustainable fiscal deficits combined with expectations that those deficits would be monetized rather than addressed through spending cuts or tax increases. Evidence for this interpretation comes from the timing of inflation's rise and fall. Inflation accelerated in the mid-1960s precisely when Great Society programs and Vietnam War spending created growing deficits. It persisted through the 1970s as deficits continued and the political system seemed incapable of addressing them. And it finally ended in the 1980s not just because Volcker raised interest rates, but because the fiscal pain of high interest rates on government debt service forced Congress to take deficits seriously. By 1990, Congress had introduced pay-go budget rules that effectively controlled deficits through the 1990s. The combination of Volcker's monetary policy creating painful consequences for deficits and Congress responding by controlling spending was what ended the inflation, not monetary policy alone. This fiscal interpretation is suppressed in official histories because it implies that central bank independence is insufficient to prevent inflation if fiscal policy remains undisciplined. If inflation is fundamentally a fiscal phenomenon resulting from unsustainable government spending financed by money creation, then the solution requires fiscal reforms and political discipline, not just technocratic central banking. This is an uncomfortable message for central bankers who prefer to believe they control inflation through monetary policy tools, and for politicians who want to believe they can spend freely as long as the central bank manages the money supply properly. The deepest secret in inflation's history is that the relationship between money supply and prices has been understood for centuries. Yet this understanding is periodically forgotten or denied for political convenience. The Salamanca school philosophers in 16th century Spain, including Martín de Azpilcueta and Tomás de Mercado, recognized that the flood of gold and silver from American colonies into Spain was causing prices to rise. Jean Bodin in France and David Hume in Scotland independently reached the same conclusion: more money in circulation causes prices to rise proportionally. In the 20th century, Irving Fisher formalized this in the quantity theory of money, and Milton Friedman later summarized it perfectly. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. This isn't controversial among economists. Both Keynesian and monetarist schools accept that in the long run, inflation is determined by money supply growth relative to economic growth. Where they differed was in emphasis and time horizon. Keynesians focused on the short run where real factors like unemployment matter and prices are sticky. Monetarists focused on the long run where prices are flexible and adjust to money supply. But both acknowledge that sustained inflation over years and decades comes from excessive money creation. Yet, despite this centuries-old understanding, the Federal Reserve and other central banks pursued policies from the 1960s through 1970s that allowed money supply to grow far faster than economic output, guaranteeing inflation. Many central banks, including the Fed, attempted to incorporate money supply targets in the late 1970s and 1980s as part of efforts to control inflation. But these targets were often abandoned when they conflicted with other policy goals, like maintaining low unemployment or supporting government borrowing. The knowledge of what causes inflation existed. The willingness to apply that knowledge consistently was absent when it conflicted with political objectives. The establishment of the 2% inflation target represents the culmination of this history and the institutionalization of permanent inflation as policy rather than accident. The Federal Open Market Committee formally adopted the 2% target in January 2012, but the journey to that announcement took decades. The idea of an explicit inflation target was first raised in the FOMC in July 1994 by Thomas Melzer, then president of the St. Louis Fed, who argued that markets were uncertain about the Fed's ultimate aims regarding inflation. For the next 18 years, the committee debated whether to announce a target, what that target should be, and how it would relate to the Fed's employment mandate. The debate revealed conflicting views about central banking's purpose. Some Fed officials, particularly from regional banks like Richmond and St. Louis, believed price stability should be the Fed's primary or sole goal, and that an explicit low inflation target would anchor expectations and prevent future inflation. Others worried that an explicit target would constrain the Fed's flexibility to respond to recessions or financial crises and would give too much weight to price stability relative to employment. And still others feared the political backlash from Congress if the Fed appeared to prioritize inflation control over job creation. Chairman Ben Bernanke finally pushed through the 2% target in 2012, motivated partly by concerns about disinflation following the 2008 financial crisis and partly by desire to enhance forward guidance effectiveness in quantitative easing. The target was presented as consistent with the Fed's mandate for price stability and as representing optimal balance between the risks of too high inflation and the dangers of deflation. But the choice of 2% rather than 0 was never rigorously justified economically. It appears to have been chosen because it was low enough to be called price stability while high enough to provide room for interest rate cuts during recessions and to ensure that nominal wages could decline in real terms without nominal wage cuts that workers resist. What's remarkable about the 2% target is how quickly it went from controversial to gospel. Before 2012, the Fed had no explicit inflation target. Many Fed officials opposed having one. But within a few years of adoption, the 2% target became treated as if it were scientifically determined, economically optimal, and obviously correct. Other central banks around the world, many of which had adopted 2% or similar targets earlier, reinforced this consensus. Today, virtually every major central bank targets roughly 2% inflation, and this is presented as economic science rather than what it actually is. A policy choice made for political and institutional convenience. The secret is that 2% inflation means money loses half its value every 35 years. It means continuous wealth transfer from savers to borrowers and from holders of currency to those who create it. It means the Federal Reserve is committed to ensuring that saving in cash is always a losing proposition, that prices will rise continuously, and that the economic stability of the pre-1914 gold standard era is permanently gone. But this reality is obscured behind technical language about anchoring expectations and providing flexibility that makes the target sound like sophisticated economic management rather than institutionalized currency debasement. The history of inflation is also the history of economic theories that justified inflationary policy. The Phillips Curve provided justification in the 1960s and 1970s for accepting inflation to achieve full employment. Modern monetary theory, a more recent development, argues that governments that print their own currency face no fiscal constraints and can spend freely until inflation appears, then use taxes to control inflation. This theory, while criticized by mainstream economists, has influenced progressive policy proposals and provides intellectual cover for deficit spending financed by money creation. Nominal GDP targeting, another recent proposal, would explicitly allow or even encourage higher inflation following recessions to return nominal GDP to trend. Each theory in its own way provides justification for policies that create inflation while presenting them as economically sophisticated responses to employment or output goals. What these theories share is a focus on short-run goals like employment and output while minimizing or ignoring the long-run wealth destruction that inflation causes. They treat inflation as a policy tool that can be precisely controlled and managed, rather than as a process that once started tends to accelerate and becomes politically difficult to stop. And they all assume that central banks and governments will exercise restraint and stop creating money before inflation becomes problematic, an assumption that historical experience repeatedly contradicts. The secret history that emerges from all this is that inflation transformed from a rare wartime emergency into permanent peacetime policy through a series of deliberate choices made for political convenience and justified by economic theories that served those political goals. The abandonment of gold removed constraints on money creation. The Employment Act of 1946 created legal mandate for policies that would prove inflationary. The Phillips Curve provided theoretical justification for accepting inflation to achieve employment goals. Regulation Q disabled the mechanisms through which monetary policy could combat inflation. Deficit spending financed by money creation became standard practice. And finally, the 2% inflation target institutionalized permanent inflation as policy, making what would have been considered currency debasement and economic malpractice in earlier eras into official central bank doctrine. At each step, the public was told that experts were managing the economy scientifically, that inflation was an unfortunate side effect of necessary policies, or that moderate inflation was actually beneficial for growth and employment. What wasn't discussed openly was that inflation served crucial political purposes. It allowed governments to spend beyond tax revenues, it reduced the real burden of government debt, it pushed taxpayers into higher brackets without legislation, and it transferred wealth from politically unorganized savers to politically influential borrowers and from the financially unsophisticated to those closest to money creation. The victims of this hidden history are ordinary people who followed traditional financial advice to save, who held currency and bonds assuming these would preserve wealth, who built retirement plans assuming price stability, and who trusted that government and central banks would protect the currency's value. They were systematically betrayed by policies that deliberately eroded that value, justified by economic theories that obscured the wealth transfer, and implemented by institutions insulated from democratic accountability. The beneficiaries were governments that could spend freely without the political cost of taxation, financial institutions closest to money creation who received and lent newly created money before inflation eroded its value, and borrowers including governments themselves who could repay debts in depreciated currency. The inflation wasn't a mistake or an accident. It was policy, chosen and sustained because those with political power benefited from it, while those who suffered lacked the economic understanding to recognize what was being done to them or the political organization to resist. Understanding this secret history changes how you see current monetary policy. When the Federal Reserve announces its 2% inflation target, you recognize this as a commitment to reduce your currency's value by half every 35 years. When officials talk about price stability, you understand they mean continuous inflation at the highest rate they think they can sustain without triggering political backlash. When economists discuss trade-offs between inflation and employment, you recognize these as arguments for why your wealth should be destroyed to serve other policy goals. And when financial advisors tell you to invest rather than save in cash, you understand this isn't just investment advice but necessary defense against policy that makes saving wealth-destroying. The secret history of inflation reveals that the monetary system you live under was constructed deliberately to enable wealth extraction through currency debasement, that the economic theories justifying this system were developed to serve political needs rather than discovered through objective science, and that the institutions implementing these policies operate with minimal accountability precisely because making them accountable would expose the wealth transfers they facilitate and risk political resistance that could constrain their power. This isn't ancient history. The policies established through the 20th century remain in force today. The Federal Reserve continues targeting 2% inflation, continues monetizing government debt through asset purchases, continues operating with independence that shields it from democratic accountability. The fiscal pressures that drove inflationary policy in the 1960s and 1970s are even worse now, with national debt exceeding $36 trillion and annual deficits exceeding $1 trillion. And the economic theories justifying inflation have become more sophisticated and influential, with modern monetary theory and other frameworks providing updated arguments for why money creation to finance spending is economically sound. The only real change is that the public has largely accepted inflation as normal and permanent rather than recognizing it as policy that could be changed. 3 generations have now lived entirely under fiat currency systems where inflation is constant. Few remember or understand that price stability was the norm for centuries under commodity-backed money. The abnormal has become normal, and questioning whether perpetual inflation is necessary or desirable marks you as economically unsophisticated or ideologically extreme rather than as someone who understands history. This normalization of inflation represents perhaps the greatest triumph in the secret history. Convincing people that continuous currency debasement is not just acceptable but optimal, that savings should lose value steadily, that economic planning beyond a few years is impossible because prices will be radically different, and that central banks targeting 2% inflation deserve credit for stability rather than criticism for institutionalized theft. When the victims of a policy defend it as necessary and criticize those who question it, the policy has achieved a level of success that doesn't require hiding anymore. The secret history becomes official history. The wealth transfer becomes sound economic management, and those losing purchasing power every year. Thank the central bankers stealing it for their prudent stewardship. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History doesn't repeat, but monetary manipulation never stops. And the secret that inflation is policy, not accident, that it's created deliberately by people with names and faces who benefit from it, that it could be prevented by simply not creating money faster than economic growth. That secret stopped being secret long ago. It's just that acknowledging it would require admitting that the entire monetary system is designed to extract wealth from ordinary people to benefit governments and financial institutions. So we pretend it's complicated, inevitable, and even beneficial. We listen to central bankers solemnly explain why 2% inflation is optimal and price stability requires continuously destroying currency value. And we congratulate ourselves on our sophisticated understanding while our savings evaporate, our wages lose purchasing power, and the wealth transfer continues exactly as designed. The secret history of inflation is that it stopped being a secret and became official policy, announced proudly, targeted explicitly, and defended as economic wisdom by the very institutions that profit from the theft. And almost no one questions it anymore because 3 generations of propaganda masquerading as economics education convinced everyone that money losing value forever is not just normal but necessary, not a policy choice but an economic law, not theft but stability. The history isn't secret, we just stopped listening to it.